Lesson 20. The Pound of Flesh. Once upon a time, there lived in Venice two very great friends. They were Antonio and Bassanio. Antonio was a rich merchant who owned a great many ships. Besides, he was kind and generous. Bassanio was poor and spent more money than he could afford. Antonio loved him and was always ready to give him money whenever he needed it. Bassanio was in love with a rich and beautiful lady named Portia, who lived in Belmont. He could not afford to buy fine presents for her. He went to Antonio and told him that he was in trouble. He asked him to lend him a sum of 3,000 ducats, gold coins. Shylock hated Antonio because he used to lend money to people free of interest, and this harmed Shylock's trade. Besides, Antonio had called Shylock dog and spat upon him, so Shylock was on the lookout for an opportunity to have his revenge. When Antonio and Bassanio went to Shylock to borrow the money, he pretended to be very glad to help Antonio. He was willing to lend him the money for 3 months free of interest. But he would like him to sign a bond. If he failed to pay the money back by that day, Shylock could cut off a pound of Antonio's flesh from nearest his heart. It was a risky bond, but Antonio signed it for the sake of his friends. Bassanio grew angry when he heard this. He begged Antonio not to risk his life for his sake. But Antonio was sure his ships would come back before the date mentioned in the bond. As soon as the bond was signed and the money taken, Bassanio left for Belmont. A letter came from Antonio bringing unhappy news. He wrote, "Dear Bassanio, my ships haven't arrived at port. The day of repayment is past. The Jew has filed a suit against me, claiming the penalty of a pound of flesh. Before I die, I want to see you and bid you farewell." When Portia heard this unhappy story, she began to act with great speed. She therefore sent a letter to a cousin of hers, a well-known lawyer, Bellario, asking for his advice. Bellario quickly sent his advice and also the lawyer's clothes which she had asked for. She called her maid and told her about her plan. Portia and her maid dressed themselves in men's clothes and left for Venice. The trial of the case began at the court of the Duke of Venice. The court was packed with Antonio's friends. The Duke had to wait for some time for Bellario, whom he had sent for. Now Portia, in the disguise of a lawyer, entered the court. She presented a letter from Bellario to the Duke and asked for permission to argue the case. The Duke readily agreed to it. Portia looked around the court and addressed Shylock. She said that Shylock indeed had a right to his pound of flesh. At the same time, in a moving speech, she appealed to him to show mercy to Antonio and not to claim the penalty. But this appeal had no effect on him. He was not going to accept the money. Then Portia said, "Shylock, take a pound of Antonio's flesh." When he heard this, he stepped towards Antonio, knife in hand. But Portia stopped him and said, "Wait a little, Jew. This bond gives you exactly 1 pound of Antonio's flesh. But if in cutting it off, you shed a single drop of Christian blood, you will pay for it with your life. This is the law of Venice." Shylock now said that he was ready to accept his money. But Portia said, "No, you can't. You have plotted against the life of a citizen of Venice. According to the law, half of your property will go to the state of Venice and the other half to Antonio. Now it is your turn to beg for mercy." The merciful Duke spared his life before he asked for it.